So the ideas I want to talk about have been interesting and important to me since my 20s, and they've taken shape in this recent book that I've published that Devin mentioned. And as you can see, the subtitle refers to three different areas: religious pluralism, individuation, and awakening. I won't be speaking about religious pluralism, but I will just mention that in the chapters that I devote to Christianity, Hinduism, and Buddhism, I discuss people that I regard to be truly exemplary figures in their respective traditions who value the other traditions and in some cases actually practice more than one themselves, which is what I think we're moving towards in the way in which spirituality is developing and taking new shapes in the world we live in now. I also would say that I count myself as a pluralist in that I personally have been deeply informed and shaped by multiple traditions, but also feel that without a doubt, people can experience what is called the sacred or the divine in many ways through all these traditions, and I think an audience like this can appreciate why that is something to celebrate and embrace. And I'm going to be talking in particular about one of these traditions, the Hindu contemplative tradition, and making some connections with Jungian psychology. Now, with respect to contemplative yoga, let me just be clear initially what I mean by that term. I'm simply using it to differentiate the various kinds of contemplation, forms of meditation, and inquiry that people can do from yogic postures, or what's called asanas, and is widely practiced now by some 30 million Americans in studios in just about every town in the country. That's a wonderful thing. It's great for your health, and sometimes it pushes beyond simply giving you good health. But generally speaking, the postures of yoga are not designed to actually precipitate the ultimate aim of what the yoga traditions have been about, and I'll be talking about those aims in some depth. So what is the focus here? The focus is self-realization, and my claim or assertion would be that it is the deepest aspiration or purpose of human existence. But that term can mean different things, and indeed does mean different things in different traditions. And I'm simply going to be looking at what it means in two different forms, namely Jung's depth psychology and the Hindu yoga traditions I've just referred to. And I'm interested in how these can be put together, how they can be integrated. So what exactly needs to be integrated, in my view? Well, it is the psychological journey of individuation, which involves circumambulating your life, circling around it, so as to be able to encompass as many aspects of what you have been into some kind of an integrated, unique whole. I think that's a fairly good way to talk about that journey. I also think of it as soul work, particularly because of the emotional element that is prominent in our psychological life. And the other journey that I want to talk about is the yogic journey of awakening, which I will contrast as more spiritual work for reasons I hope to make much more clear as we proceed. So those are the two things that I want to integrate, and now let's talk about them in a little bit more detail. So what distinguishes individuation in the Jungian sense would be that you are integrating the content, the experiences of your life, and it is a developmental maturation process, and we could characterize it as growing up, provided that we fully appreciate that this kind of journey is going to involve a descent, probably more than one descent into your depths, but in the service of you becoming a truly more mature, fully functioning, flourishing human being. Now, the notion of awakening, the very word itself suggests waking up, in contrast to growing up. And here, we're talking about essentially discovering your original face before your parents were born. Now, that phrase might make you ponder a little bit here, because it's a koan, actually, from the Zen tradition. So it means somehow accessing some deep dimension of what you are that is not actually shaped by particular experiences of childhood, adolescence, midlife, and so forth. It's something different, and accordingly, the methods for accessing this part, if we make the assumption that such a dimension exists, will be different than psychological methods. So the primary method typically is one form of meditation or another, and while content certainly does arise in your mind as you meditate, sensations, emotions, and thoughts, the general practice in most forms of meditation is to merely observe and witness them like clouds passing in the sky. In other words, you don't engage the content. Instead, you allow your mind to settle and descend into what is below the thought waves, the backdrop and source of those fluctuating waves. And that backdrop or source, we could say, is consciousness itself. And to abide in that source in meditation would eventually, if you work at it a long time, lead you into a state of awareness that the yogic tradition calls samadhi, or more precisely, one of the states or degrees of samadhi that occur when the ordinary machinations of the mind become still and silent. Now, this kind of practice is not analyzing what arises in the psyche. Instead, it is dissolving what ordinarily arises, so this deeper dimension of what you are can disclose itself. And that deeper dimension is what the Hindus would call alternately either the Atman or Purusha, or the capital S, self, as it would be typically translated in English, or what the Buddhists would call emptiness, or a more apt term that suggests more to us your inherent Buddha nature, or what the Sufis would call your supreme identity. In any case, it is your original face by whatever name we refer to it by. Now, both of these modes, the psychological journey and this awakening journey, I think are profound ways of inner work. They're very noble, and it's my observation, I think fair to say, that most people who get interested in inner work take up one of these modes or journeys and not the other. I'm among those who think that to pursue one of these without the other can be incomplete and one-sided, and in particular, I think to pursue the spiritual journey without attending to psychological issues is what is aptly called spiritual bypassing and can have rather unfortunate consequences. So, putting it briefly, one can experience deep mystical or ecstatic states, but these generally do not take care of issues pertaining to anger, greed, power, lust, depression, or relationships. It may help some, but this is not primarily what meditation is designed to do. Now, conversely, a person could engage for years in psychotherapeutic work, and it would be helpful, no doubt, but never discuss this original face. Never discover, I'm sorry to say, the original face, to continue with the metaphor. And furthermore, and I find this really quite startling to think about, a Zen master may have experienced a profound Kensho or Satori experience, or even a number of them, and still be patriarchal, sexist, homophobic, nationalistic, xenophobic, and so on. And we could say the same, of course, about somebody who's in the Christian tradition, Hindu or Buddhist tradition, and the reason being that the contemplative practices don't necessarily take care of the psychological work that each and every one of us needs to do. So I'll move, there's really three parts to tonight's talk, and the first part I'll explore a bit Jung's psychological journey, the second part, the contemplative yogic journey, and the third, a brief presentation on one way, my way, of putting these things together. So let's, this may be, here's a nice picture of C.G. Jung, a very famous picture of him. Let's just be clear about some of our terms here so that we're all kind of relating to this material in the same way. So simply put and briefly put, the self for Jung would be the totality of the psyche that includes not only your conscious awareness, but also the unconscious that we're generally not aware of. And that larger totality, the center of that, is what the self is, whereas the ego is only the center of what we're consciously aware of. Now, individuation, as I already tried to suggest, is a developmental process of discovering what Jung means by the self. It's a vigilant process by which you become increasingly whole, and as he said quite correctly in my view, it is the purpose of a well-lived life, in fact, the opus of a lifetime. Here's a picture of his memoir, and I want to talk to you a little bit about that because he tells us that in this text that he, early in the text, around the time of his break from Freud, he entered a period of time that he called the confrontation with his unconscious, which I think lasted a good 6 years. And he tells us that one day while sitting at his desk, he let himself plunge into the depths of his psyche, submitting to the spontaneous images that arose from his unconscious. And this was the beginning of a process that lasted for several years and provided a great wealth of material, much of which is documented visually in the splendid book, The Red Book. And throughout these years of practice, of engaging what's coming up from the unconscious, he documented his dreams, his experiences, his fantasies, and embellished it with the splendid artwork of his. And also during that time, he drew mandalas, and particularly as he was emerging from the more crisis phase of this period of time. And as he did this, he became increasingly more whole. And I'll quote very briefly from Memory Stream's Reflections. He said, "When I began to draw the mandalas, I saw that everything, all the paths I had been following, all the steps that I had taken were leading to a single point, namely the midpoint, and it became increasingly plain that that mandala, these mandalas he was drawing, is that center." And he began to, his inner peace was restored, and he began to feel the great significance that was coming from these years of confrontation with his unconscious. And he wrote, continuing here, that in finding the mandala as the expression of the self, I knew, quoting him here, that I had attained what was for me the ultimate. Perhaps someone else knows more, but not I. So the mandalas then symbolize the goal of the individuation process for Jung, the realization of the self, and I think we owe it to ourselves to, just of what I've just been saying here, to visually enjoy, some of these splendid images. I've just selected, 5 of them from the Red Book here, and I'll just let us take a look at each of them for a few seconds here. Okay, so that moves us to the next thing I want to talk about here. So Jung's inner work has some affinities to the contemplative yoga I'll be talking about later, especially Tantric practices. And mandalas are a good case in point because mandalas actually are indigenous to the Hindu and Buddhist traditions and something rather less familiar, to the Western mind. And Jung's mandalas were original images that he produced rather than the more codified images that the Eastern traditions would utilize and reuse as the means for what the purpose that they serve, the contemplative purposes that they serve. But in addition to mandalas, another parallel would be the priority that Jung gives to introspection, which is certainly what is involved with meditation, the interiorization process whereby you generate tapas, or a psychic heat, which for the yogi, as Jung correctly said, involves withdrawing libido from the external world and directing it towards the inner world. And that kind of interiorization is closely akin to the Jungian practice of active imagination. However, there is a significant difference, and that is that in the yoga traditions, you focus typically on a single object or image. It could be the breath, it could be a mantra, it could actually be a visual image. And by doing so, your attention becomes ever more gathered and focused on that single point, which is the precondition for the state of samadhi, or deep spiritual realization or awakening, or state of being to actually emerge and unfold. Whereas in Jung's psychology, by contrast, he does not, active imagination does not prescribe a particular object or image or any particular technique. Now, Jung does tell us in his memoir that he practiced yoga during this period I've referred to earlier, but only for a limited purpose. And here, again, I will briefly quote him. He said, "I would do these exercises only until I had calmed myself enough to work with the unconscious. And as soon as I had the feeling that I was myself again, I abandoned the restraint upon the emotions and allowed the images and inner voices to speak afresh." The Indian, by which he's referring here now to the Hindu yoga traditions, on the other hand, does yoga exercises in order to obliterate completely the multitude of psychic contents and images. So I want to shift now to a 1932 seminar that Jung gave on Kundalini Yoga, and which I write about in some detail in the chapter on Jung within my book. But here I want to kind of provide you a brief sketch, which will prove to be a segue into the discussion of yoga. So first of all, let's get clear about how Jung understands yoga. He says, first off, it's a natural process of introversion. Secondly, he was very interested in the chakras, which I'll be talking about in just a moment, because they provide a rich storehouse of symbolic depictions of the individuation process. In fact, he thought Kundalini Yoga was evidence of individuation from another culture. But third, and I think this is the most important point I want to make for the talk that I'm giving here tonight, and here I quote a passage here, and I'll emphasize the key element of it here. The chakras become a valuable guide for us, meaning Westerners, in this obscure field because the East, and India especially, has always tried to understand the psyche as a whole. It has an intuition of the self, and therefore sees the ego and ego awareness as only more, as a less essential aspect or part of the self. And all of this seems very strange to us, again speaking about Westerners, because it appears as though India was fascinated by the background of consciousness, or as I suggested earlier, consciousness itself, because we ourselves, as Westerners, are entirely identified with the foreground, with the conscious, or what I've also described as the contents that arise in consciousness. Now, Jung's primary interest in the chakras was their symbolic content, rather than consciousness or awareness itself that was just being distinguished. And here again, just for visual appreciation, I just want to show you a number of chakra images before I talk about his take on them. So here we see this copper plate, with the various chakras embossed on the human form. Now beginning at the root chakra, Ladera, at the base of the spine. We have the first one here, then in the more genital region. All these, by the way, are in the subtle body, not the actual physical anatomy. This is the second one. Here's the third one at the navel area, Manipura. Anahata at the heart. Vishuddha at the throat. Ajna, the third eye. And then, although it's unrepresentable, the thousand-petaled lotus crown chakra called Sahasrara. So Jung was essentially focused on, pointed me earlier here, on the first four, namely the root, the genital, the navel, and the heart. And in the seminar, his comments about the chakras are scattered throughout the four different sessions of the seminar. And I'm going through this in a more linear way just to show a certain progression. That's not the way they're actually discussed in the seminar. And it's an extremely brief gloss, but I think it will serve to make a basic point I'm trying to make here tonight. So what he says about the root chakra is essentially that the gods or the self are asleep. Conscious, the ego's awake, but the gods or the self is asleep. Nevertheless, he goes on at some considerable length to talk about how absolutely important it is to be grounded in the root chakra. And in fact says, if you're not grounded there, you're never born. And in point of fact, we see people walking around every day that are not born. and that's a great tragedy, and looking at the high end of what's possible for us as humans, if you're not fully born, not really grounded in the root chakra, you cannot realize the self. It's not really even within the realm of possibility. So with the genital region chakra, he calls it the mandala of baptism because it involves a descent into the sea, which means the unconscious, or what he also calls the Leviathan, and you encounter what is there, what's in the depths. And the result is either going to be quite positive, a kind of rebirth, or actually the opposite, quite destructive if you can't navigate the intensity of that kind of a descent. With the navel chakra, the fire center of the emotions, the key thing I think he stresses in the seminar here is that your ability to tolerate the emotion and the affect that is arising there, it is absolutely essential for your psychological growth because it provides the fuel. It's the fuel for transformation. And since we're here at the Joseph Campbell RoundTable session here, this would be a good moment to quote Jung on his particular observation regarding the third chakra, because this passage has always, I thought, been very, very interesting and important here. And I'll just read it as you view it here. The first three chakras dominate the first 35 years of a person's life. If unconstrained, these energies become devastating. To transcend this order of life requires an awakening of the heart, namely, a turning about of the energy as an application of all the available malice and aggression of chakra 3, not outward for the correction of the world, but inward upon yourself. So certainly here we see the motif of interiorization, and interiorization that serves a very noble purpose. And that purpose begins to emerge, really, in Jung's view, when you reach the level of the heart, because, as you see here, he says, here something entirely new happens because you rise above the dramas, the emotional dramas and other kinds of events in your life that keep you conflicted and, in some ways, entrapped. And it is at this level, truly speaking, that individuation truly begins. Now, he actually says very little about the next three, but some of the things he says are, I think, quite interesting. And why, by the way, does he say so little? Well, first of all, he feels that Western people in particular, and culturally, we barely are at that level. It's not really where we are yet in our culture or civilization. But for those of us who arrive there or get a glimpse of what our psychological maturation could be at that level, you begin to discover or consider that the game of the world is your own game, and the people outside of you are actually a reflection of your psyche. The world itself becomes a reflection of the psyche. This is profoundly psychological, yet, as I already said, pretty much beyond the experience of Westerners. So if he didn't have much to say about the throat, he had even less to say about the next two, but nevertheless, I'm going to say something. And at the third eye level, one experiences another reality, what he calls the non-ego, which is a synonym for the self, and actually the non-ego and the self for Jung are actually equivalent, really, to the notion of God. And it's an almost imaginable experience, but here, at this level, the God's or self that was asleep at the root chakra is now awake. So at the crown chakra, this is going to be maybe very disappointing, but hold on, don't give up, all right? Because the first thing he says is beyond, it's really kind of beyond human experience and is, therefore, an entirely speculative concept without practical value for us. See the italics in the red font there. And if that was where it ended, you know, if you're like me, you'd be a little disappointed. But footnotes, endnotes, appendices, well worth reading. Because in one of the appendices, the second one in fact, he says some additional comments, and I'm going to read a little preface that precedes this, and I'll show you a second slide that comes after it. And basically, what he writes just prior to what you see here is that in the typical course of an analysis, awareness expands through working through repressions and projections, but the relation relationship of the ego to its objects or contents persists, and the ego is intertwined in conflict with those objects. However, by continuing the analysis to a deeper level, there an analogy with yoga comes in. If consciousness can be severed from its objects, a detachment that he links to the process of individuation, and he continues to say it is as if consciousness separates from the objects and from the ego and emigrates to the non-ego, the other center, or again, the self. Now, he goes on to say, this is not something that I can prove philosophically, but it is a psychological experience that one feels to be of deliverance. What has caused one to previously be seized by panic is not panic anymore, because one is capable of seeing the tension of the opposites without agitation. One does not become apathetic, but is freed from entanglement. So while there are these affinities between Kundalini Yoga and Jung psychology, I do want to briefly disagree with this assessment regarding the higher three chakras, the throat, third eye, and the crown chakras. Because by focusing on the chakras as symbols that explicate or provide evidence from another culture of his own psychology, he neglects to acknowledge their significance for actual practitioners of these yogic traditions, either the Indians or Westerners who would take up the practice. And furthermore, he does not, although he focuses on the developmental process of individuation, he does not here in this seminar or elsewhere encourage people to actually practice yoga as a spiritual discipline. In fact, to the contrary, he rather strongly advises Westerners to not do so. And in my view, his admonitions unnecessarily detour mature individuals from undertaking time-tested practices for awakening to the inner self that the Hindu tradition calls the Atman. So with that, we'll shift to that tradition, the tradition of contemplative yoga. So first of all, how can we quickly but very, I think, insightfully understand what yoga is? There are many definitions of it, and they mostly pertain to either the phases of the nearly 5,000 years in which yoga has been practiced, or the most important texts that have appeared at various periods of time throughout that long span of history, in which yoga is given a rather particular kind of definition. So I think this is a very useful kind of overview, and we'll look more closely at some of these subsequently. But so first of all, and this would be following a kind of historical sequence. So the oldest kind of source in the before the Common Era would be the text of the Upanishads, where the essential meaning is union with the divine, or if we want to put it another way, the ground of our being. Then around the beginning of the Common Era with the Yoga Sutras, which would be the classical text of the yoga tradition, in the second sutra, the basic translation would be the stilling or cessation of the mental and emotional fluctuations of the mind. That is what yoga is. Roughly just shortly thereafter, in the Bhagavad Gita, there are actually two definitions, 2 verses apart in the second chapter. Yoga is equanimity or evenness of mind, and also, interestingly, it's defined as skill in action. But then fast forward another 8 centuries, let's say, to the medieval period when the Tantric tradition emerges, which is what Jung thought was the closest affinity of the yoga traditions to his psychology. There's a definition that I'll be talking more about later, which is it's a kind of merging with the self, but also a merging or oneness with the world. So that's the overview, and we'll kind of step into these a little bit later in more detail. But before we do that, I imagine that many of you are familiar with the great Indologist Heinrich Zimmer, because Joseph Campbell said, if I had a guru, it was Zimmer. And it was at Columbia University where Campbell studied under Zimmer before his sudden and untimely death, and which resulted in Campbell editing 4 of Zimmer's unfinished manuscripts, including the particular book, Myths and Symbols in Indian Art and Civilization, that I'm actually drawing from right now. Because and I put Zimmer Campbell because Campbell is the editor and the person who actually kind of completed that work and three others. And what I'll say they write, is that the greatest achievement of the sages of the Hindu tradition, reflected in the Upanishads, was the discovery of a self which the sages regarded to be a kind of independent, imperishable entity that underlies the conscious personality and the physical body. Now, aside from discovering that, it was also their conviction that our naive unawareness of that self is, in fact, the primary cause of all of our misplaced emphases in life, misplaced attitudes, and self-inflicted existential suffering. So the word for that, is ignorance, avidya in Sanskrit. It's the fundamental problem, not knowing the nature of reality and not knowing the self. And both Indian philosophy and Hindu mythology refer to this as Maya, which is typically translated as illusion. And as Zimmer points out in this book, I think very insightfully, that we could say, psychologically speaking, Maya is the net of entanglement that distorts our understanding. So what's the task? Well, it would be to get beyond that kind of entanglement, to know how that process of being confused or not knowing oneself and not knowing the nature of reality, how that actually works, and to transcend the spell, actually, that puts upon our life. That's our task. And I think in this beautiful second statement here, and Zimmer puts it, then the task would be to learn the secret of that entanglement and to cut through into a reality beneath the emotional and intellectual convolutions that enwrap our conscious being, or put it another way, our ego awareness or ego attitude. Okay, so if you are able to learn that secret and access what is deep within oneself, that results in what the yoga tradition calls liberation or moksha and self-realization. Yoga is the means to that discovery, to that freedom, by which you move from being a small, contracted sense of who you are, very limited identity, to one that is more expanded, in which you discover this original face I referred to at the beginning of the talk. Now, the Upanishads, which I referred to earlier, these dialogues between sages and students, convey the basic idea that the inmost self is the Atman. That's what they call this. And what are its characteristics? Well, I think I've distilled it as concisely as you can make it. It's regarded to be self-luminous, birthless and deathless, ever-present, and interestingly, in the Upanishads, they talk about three states of consciousness that we all know quite well: waking, dreaming, dreamless sleep. But they say there's also a fourth, actually a fifth, which is even a more subtle version of the fourth, which is typically translated as the witness state, or turiya, to use the Sanskrit word, and it's said to be hidden in the lotus of the heart. So the yoga of the Upanishads has to do mostly with discerning that dimension of yourself through a kind of sophisticated discrimination process called viveka. And accordingly, then, it is, when we delineate different kind of yogas, which I'll soon be doing, it would be the yoga of knowledge, or jnana yoga rather. And there are a number of great sayings, mahavakyas, in the text, and one of the major four is one that we know from some of Campbell's work. That thou art, or in Sanskrit, tat tvamasi, that is the Atman, your inmost essence, which is identical to the all-pervasive, all-inclusive reality, which is the Brahman. The Atman is the Brahman. There's an ontological identity in these teachings. Now, the trick about the Jnana Yoga, it's said to be the form of yoga that most people are least qualified and least inclined temperamentally to practice. It can be very intellectual, so one way to approach it is philosophically. However, there is a much more direct experiential way to access this kind of knowledge. And I'm going to show you the slides of two figures. The first you're already seeing here, Ramana Maharshi. And you'll notice, by the way, that there was a foreword to this. by C.G. Jung, which is actually a portion. I'm not sure how Shambhala Publications actually did this, but they took a portion of an essay that Jung wrote on yoga, and it became the forward, to this beautiful, slender, profound edition of his teaching. Well, what is it in an absolute nutshell? It takes the form, because it's a yoga of knowledge, takes the form of self-inquiry, and specifically, the form that he enjoined people to practice is to ask yourself intensely, not like you would repeat a mantra, by the way, but the way you would brood upon a Zen koan, who am I? And it's a via negativa experience, because you realize, well, I'm not fundamentally a male or a female. I'm not fundamentally in midlife or a senior citizen. I'm not fundamentally gay or straight. I'm not fundamentally rich or poor. After you negate all these things, what's left is what you actually are. You're the seer, the feeler, the thinker that beholds all these things. Now, the next figure, a bit scary here, is Nisargadatta Maharaj. And just so it doesn't get too intense here, here's the second tape. He also had a very warm heart, okay? And there were a number of books that were transcribed from his talks, and one of the most famous, which is aptly, indeed, a modern spiritual classic, is this nearly 500-page book called I Am That, which I highly recommend. It was one of the books that I've read a couple of times, and we'll need to read again very, very slowly, because it also distills how to kind of tune into this deep dimension of oneself without the use of a lot of philosophy, but by looking very, very deeply in a very discriminating way on what you actually are. Now, much like the question, who am I, his variation on it is simply to try to enter into the very deep felt experience of what is your I amness. Now, as I've suggested, this is the yoga of discriminating knowledge or wisdom, and what I want to point out here is classically it is a path of renunciation or withdrawal from the activities of worldly life. So as we look at the next form of yoga that is codified in the Yoga Sutras, basically it is frequently called Raja Yoga, the royal yoga, and it is the yoga of meditation. And this is the approach whereby, by sitting quietly and focusing on a single object, the mind gradually quiets down enough that the self shines forth. And the word for the self in this particular text is Purusha. It's absolutely identical to the word Atman in the Upanishads. They mean the same thing, namely pure consciousness without content, the witness or the seer. Now, it also, like the teachings of the Upanishad, tends to be an approach traditionally and classically that has led to a certain disengagement, with the world. Now, with the Bhagavad Gita, early in the Common Era, we have an example of a very synthetic text, which is to say it has synthesized earlier phases of the yogic tradition in a way that includes 4 different practices or forms of yoga. So the 2 that we've already considered are part and parcel of the book. So early chapters focus on Jnana Yoga, or the Yoga of Knowledge. Chapter 6, dhyana is the word for meditation, focuses on meditation, but it introduces and greatly emphasizes actually 2 other approaches. Karma Yoga being the yoga of work, the yoga of service, in which the idea of renunciation or withdrawing from life gets completely revisioned into actually working with an attitude of non-attachment in an attitude of truly wanting to be of service. So renunciation now actually means skill in action. If you recall, that was one of the other definitions of yoga I had referred to earlier. And then last but not least, in fact, if it extols one of these paths more than any of the others, it is the yoga of love, or devotional love. So all 4 of these are emphasized, and one of the great things, among other things, about the text is that it not only provides several paths that correlate with different temperaments, They also can be combined. You can pursue any one of them, or you can combine 2 or 3 or all 4 of them. And they are focused, last but not least, I think most importantly, in fact, on experiencing spiritual awakening while being fully engaged in the world. These are what are called householder paths, not paths for monks and nuns and renunciates. Now, this is not the end game yet for the contemplative yoga tradition, because what I will call its latest, although it's hardly new, it actually emerged in the medieval period, would be the Tantric tradition. And let's start with the word Tantra itself, which has 2 main meanings. One, which is to expand not only your wisdom or knowledge, but expand your identity from being a small, narrow, skin-encapsulated ego to something much bigger than that. But also it's a word that means a continuum that connects, among other things, spirit and matter. So it's in that sense, and other senses as well, that it's considered to be quote-unquote non-dual, and it sees spirit as fully inhering in matter and also thus in the human body. Now, the most available form of this tradition in the West, it's now been effectively transmitted during the last 40 years, and there are a great number of texts in translation as well, but more importantly, sangras, or groups where you can learn how to practice this kind of yoga, is what's often called non-dual Shaiva Tantra. And the ultimate aim of this is to integrate the masculine and the feminine principles, known respectively as Shiva and Shakti. So what are these principles, very briefly here? So Shiva, although a personified deity, and I will show you an image in a minute, in this tradition is primarily understood to be consciousness itself. It's the quote-unquote masculine principle. It's personified as the Lord, as the Nataraja, or the Lord of the cosmic dance, the Mahayogi, or great yogi, and also in the symbol of the lingam. And Shakti would be the creative energy, or the feminine principle, personified as goddesses, chiefly Parvati, Kali, and symbolized in another way as the Yoni. So these are 2 aspects of the singularity, thus a non-dual reality. So to get a little bit of imagery here, this would be Shiva as the Lord of the cosmic dance. This slide here is an image of Shiva with his consort, the goddess Parvati. But to really underscore the point about them being a singularity, this is a depiction of the Lord who is half woman, Ardha Narishvara. And the left side of the body, actually which we see are depicted on the right, is female, and the right side, or Shakti, or Parvati, and the right side of the body is male, or Shiva. So it's always understood in this tradition that when you have one, you have both, and actually the aim of life is to integrate the 2. So there are many texts within this non-dual Shaiva Tantric tradition. Some of them are very, very lengthy, and lucky for us, some of them are incredibly short. So this particular text, called the Recognition Sutras, which would be an English way of translating the Pratyabhijna Hridayayam, which means the heart of realization, or heart of recognition, consists of simply 20 sutras. You could actually put them on a single page. Now, to do justice to them, you need a 450-page book like this. But I'm going to just very, very briefly gloss it to kind of bring together ideas I wanted to present to you. So first of all, the basic idea is that the universe is a creative play of consciousness in which Shakti, the feminine principle, becomes all of the diverse forms of the manifest cosmos, including each of us. Shiva is the universal consciousness, which actually becomes contracted into the individual soul as the jiva. So the Shiva becomes the jiva. Basically, the whole aim of yoga is the reverse of it. The jiva, the contracted individual soul, needs to become Shiva once again. That happens through a process of self-recognition that is typically initiated through a process called Shaktipat, a word which would mean the descent of this energy into your body, which could occur in a ritual initiation where a teacher would either touch you or look at you in a certain way, and that energy is transmitted and it kind of ignites a sort of process whereby the Kundalini Shakti that is dormant in the root chakra begins to awaken and ascend on its ultimate journey to this union of Shiva and Shakti at the crown. And this awakening occurs through what the text refers to as inner movement and unfolding the center. And these, so obviously inner movement means interiorization that I've been referring to. Unfolding the center also means a kind of expansion of what is discovered through that interiorization. And this can be done through different yogas that may emphasize physical means, intellectual means, or means that ultimately go beyond thought. And although they're codified in discrete ways, the actual experience of most people is it can be a kind of fluid experience. So here's an image of the coiled serpent, the Kundalini Shakti, that's before it ascends. And the only other text I want to mention here as I move closer to completion here is the Radiance Sutras, which is actually a compilation of 112 ways of meditating on experiences that are available to all of us. Breathing, music, sexuality, intense emotion of any kind, the beauty of nature, and other portals, all of which open one to the radiance and splendor that inheres in matter, in the body, in our human relational life. This is a very beautiful recent translation, very accessible, very poetic, and wanted to bring only those two texts to your attention, the Recognition Sutras and the Radiance Sutras. Now, to sum up this portion here, the vision of this form of the contemplative yoga tradition is that it is not enough through introversion and introverted concentration to discover the self. That's step one. That's pretty important. And that is called Atma Vyapi. The ultimate aim actually is to turn the interiorized attention back out into the world through how you perceive others, how you perceive nature, and so forth. So that is what is meant as merging with the world, or Shiva Vyapi. To put it another way, sequentially speaking, first one sees divinity within, then one beholds it everywhere. And one who does that experiences what's called liberation in the body, or living liberation, Jivan Mukta. So that is the closure on the second part of the talk. So the third part will be fairly brief. And first I just begin by saying, I try to convey to you that Jungian depth psychology is a process that supports growing up, the cultivation of ever greater wholeness, including integrating the shadow and dealing with the contents of the psyche, whatever those contents may be. Contemplative yoga supports waking up, discovering a deeper dimension, what I referred to earlier as your original face before your parents were born. Integrative spiritualities, and I'm certainly not suggesting there's one such thing. I'm suggesting there are many such things, and that's, I think, a leading edge for what we can be doing today. Integrating psychological and spiritual growth would combine both. So that being said, what do I think, and what do some others think, would be the ingredients of an integrated spirituality, whatever shape that takes? I think there has to be a somatic dimension to it. There clearly has to be an emotional, relational, psychological aspect. Personally, I think there has to be intellectual, and then finally some kind of meditative, contemplative process. And it's the integration of these that produce the kind of integration that I'm saying I think is important. So, what does it look like in my own case? About 10 practices that I have to say, I haven't done these through most of my life. They've been kind of gradually dawning on me, oh, I see I need this. This needs to be integrated and so forth. So, in fact, the somatic part, I have to say, came rather late. But that could be as simple as walking, stretching, hatha yoga, or yin yoga classes that I happen to take twice a week. Chanting mantras is something that is important to some people. It's been important to me. Deity yoga actually is a term that belongs to the Tibetan Buddhist Tantric tradition, but it also can be a way of talking about what one can do within the Hindu contemplative yoga tradition. And for me, for example, prayer is a form of deity yoga. It's a way of accessing and activating certain archetypal energies that I want to cultivate that are within myself. I would say, as many have, that meditation is the royal road to awakening, although it is incomplete. Temperamentally, that might not be the case for many people, including many of you. Contemplative reading is, I think, a beautiful thing to do. I stumbled into it some 15, 20 years ago. When I get up in the morning after taking a shower and making a few stretches, I pick a book that has to qualify. I get to judge whether it qualifies or not. If it's contemplative reading, and I just read it really slowly while I drink that tea. And the study of texts, such as the ones I had mentioned to you, classical ones, the Yoga Sutras, but maybe the Radiant Sutras, texts like that, the Upanishads. Self-inquiry, which can take many forms, including journaling, which is an important form it takes for me, dream work. And I actually would want to say, lest I forget to say it, I actually think that self-inquiry, whatever form it takes, is really the bridge between contemplative practices and more psychological work. Because whatever form it takes, you're looking at what is it that you're experiencing right now. Are you aware of it? Can you name it? Can you name the emotion? Are you sad? Are you frustrated? Are you jealous? Just being more and more attentive to what that is, whether you judge that to be something rather noble or not, is beside the point, because self-inquiry as well is one of the most important modes for engaging in shadow work. So why is it that you're judging other people? Why is it you're judging yourself? Why is it you're in conflict with your spouse or co-workers and so forth? It really is imperative. Finally, or not finally, but the last set that I want to briefly mention to you is there's a Native American practice of, it can be done with two people, which is what I mostly do with my beloved spouse who's sitting here on the side of the room, first row, second person over, where one person, you decide the amount of time, could be an hour, could be 30 minutes, but basically whoever goes first talks uninterrupted with good quality attention from the other person, and then you switch. So that is I like to think of that as relational yoga, and it's been pretty helpful, I would say, for me. I think she might agree, but I won't put her on the spot. Periodic psychotherapy has been important to me. I've done it several different times, particularly at liminal phases of my life. Making the most important career change that I made in my life was definitely a time when I went into analysis. Another period of time actually went after a retreat in India that seemed very profound and deep and fulfilling. I came home and found that I wasn't really able to integrate it into my life, so that was another good reason to go back into analysis. It's also earth therapy. Bob Dylan said in one of his famous songs, "You got to serve somebody." I just think service is indispensable. If we don't serve, we're not really being human beings that are worth the name. That can take many forms, including regarding your own work. You know, whatever work you do is karma yoga. And the last two that you see here would be retreats, which are simply an opportunity to take whatever your daily or fairly regular practice would be, take it much more deeply over 3, 4, 5 days a week or so. I do 3 of those a year at least, about a week apiece. And I've also had the good fortune to be able to travel to India 7 times to do prolonged retreats in a land that I find very beautiful and very edifying for my life. So with that, I'll say that's it. There'll be questions at some point, but that may be after the break, or how do you want to do that?
Usually that's how we do it. Yeah.
So thank you for listening, and I hope some of you will stay to engage in dialogue. Yes, please.
Yeah, so I was kind of curious about the original face that you brought up a few times, and maybe perhaps how that concept differs from like Jung's collective unconscious, and I don't know, like if there are similarities or some relational aspect of that.
Yeah, you know, I decided not, I'm going to say a few things, but I'm also going to put a slide up that actually might be interesting. It occurred to me to put a few extra slides in here. So this is actually a Buddhist model of consciousness of a particular school. It's called the Yoga Charya school. and it's called the 9 consciousnesses, plural. And as you can see, the first 5 of our senses would be 5 of them. So hearing provides 1 mode of consciousness, tasting, touching, and so forth. In the all Buddhist schools of thought also think that the mind itself is like another sense that organizes the other 5 streams of input. But when we get to level 7, this would be the subconscious, it's just below the threshold of conscious awareness. What they call the storehouse consciousness, and this is a fairly ancient idea, well, it goes back at least to about the 4th century, the Common Era. That basically is, for all practical purposes, the equivalent of Jung's notion of the collective unconscious. And what I would say, I think this is fair and accurate, is there really isn't a map, so to speak, that Jung gives us, or that the Jungians give us, that says much of anything about there being this 9th consciousness. This would be the realm of the original face. And there was an interesting book, it's now out of print, but still, you can still access it these days, called the Jung Self and Liberation, subtitled the Jung Buddhism Dialogue. And there's a number of essays in there by Japanese Zen masters and Western psychologists and so forth. And they debate this. In fact, it also includes a debate that Jung had just 3 years before he died. A Zen master from Japan visited him in Kustak. And it was a complicated thing because they were speaking different languages, and there was a translator, and for a long time, decades really, the dialogue was never quite translated. But eventually it did get translated. It's now been translated twice in the volume I referred to in another subsequent volume. And in that, you could see where they were sort of kind of missing one another. They were trying to find some common ground. But your question kind of bears on where they didn't quite connect, because and this is my rendition of what I remember and what I think I understand about it, which was that Jung, this gets a little technical, but bear with me. Jung was very influenced by the philosopher Immanuel Kant, and there's a very particular kind of assumption about what we can know in Kant's philosophy, and Jung inherited that and took it on, which was completely appropriate for him to do so. And the key distinction I want to make goes like this, in using English, of course. We cannot know the thing in itself. Now, the thing in itself, plural, would be phenomena, or phenomenon singular. Okay, the thing in itself would be the noumenon, right? So Jung was cautious and very clear and precise about saying, for example, we can know a great deal about our God images, what we think about the sacred or the divine, but we actually can't know, first of all, we don't actually really know, or can't prove that there is God, what we call God, or divinity. But even so, we can only know it through the images we have of it. The thing itself, in this case, the ultimate noumenon, if there is a divinity, we can't know. Well, the contemplative traditions, and Zen in particular, say actually we can. And basically through Zazen, which was sitting meditation, I'm thinking of one of the essays, or thinking of that actual dialogue between Jung and Isamatsu, which is the name of the Japanese Zen master. He said, well, the way of Zazen and koan is actually to break through the whole construct of the conscious and unconscious. And when you break through the bottom of the pail or whatever, you find yourself, in this domain. And Jung just basically said, look, I'm agnostic. Didn't say it didn't exist. He just said, basically, we can't know. We can't know what it is. Does that fit your question?
Yeah.
Okay. So there's they come close because, the archetype of the self would actually be, especially in Jung's psychology, as opposed to, say, Hillman's version of it, is the supreme archetype. It's the archetype of wholeness. There's nothing beyond that. But it still belongs to, well, it's hard to say, you know, does it belong entirely to the collective unconscious, or is it somehow another envelope that's a little bigger than the unconscious and the ego that's also part of this totality, you know, that's called the self? I think that's what I could say.
Yeah.
Okay.
I appreciate this image. I think it's a
I'm
good
glad I
visual
have it. Yeah, sometimes
of
an
what
image
you're
helps
talking
better
about.
than, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome. Please.
Can you speak a little bit about how the somatic aspect of practice intersects with this diagram that you just have up there? Is it reflected there? And how does lack of mobility or early childhood development or, you know, end of life immobility affect the integration of the inside world and the outside world?
I want to make sure I really take the question in, and I think there's two parts to it. So help me again with the first part.
Well, and
Well, I'll put the diagram. I don't know if it helps, we'll use it. If it doesn't help, we won't use it, but okay.
no, it's in relationship to this because your process was, the beginning thing was somatic, and then...
Oh, in terms of what I was saying, the components of an integrated spirituality should have a somatic element.
And is the somatic element reflected in this diagram? And what if you don't have mobility? I mean, are we talking somatic in early childhood development and developing the brain so that it can get to these states of consciousness?
I see. Okay, so let's, if you can bear with me, I'll take it one step at a time. So, okay, so since you're interested in how it does relate to the diagram, I would say, yes, our five senses, for sure, represent our somatic life. So, a form of spiritual practice, or, you know, could be, I mean, even the quintessential form of meditation is paying attention to your breath. That's somatic. Your breath is somatic. Now, you can add things to it. You could blend, like one practice I did for many years, this is taught, okay, yes, watch your breath coming in, watch your breath coming out, but commingle a mantra with the in-breath and the out-breath. So you're just adding a little bell and whistle to the breath. But, and then if you even think of the classical teaching in the Yoga Sutras about, okay, there are 8 limbs. What are the limbs? Well, the first 2 limbs do have to do with things to avoid doing, don't steal, don't lie, etc. Things that you should do, you know, have devotion, tell the truth, etc. But when you start with the very next limb, it's asana. What is asana? Being able to be in some kind of posture. But apropos your question, I'm really thinking it through as I'm answering you. Well, classically you might think, well, gee, if you can't sit in a half lotus position or a full lotus position or something, I guess you're not going to be able to do these kind of meditation practices. Wrong. You know, first of all, I long ago had to give up the notion that I could sit very long in any kind of cross-legged position on the floor. So I got off my zafu and I sit in a chair. Because actually, how does it, there's only one posture, by the way, in the Yoga Sutra, and it is asana. And it's very important, because why is it important? It's any posture that you can be in for a prolonged period of time without distraction. Well, that could be laying down. So I'm starting to jump ahead a little bit to the latter part of your question. Because if due to immobility, as you said, or advanced age and so on, as long as you can still breathe, and as long as you can still be comfortable, even in a laying down. In fact, I've actually been in groups where sometimes they would alternate between sitting up in whatever position you're in and laying down. I personally avoided it because I simply didn't want to fall asleep. And just the act of being more upright kept me more alert and a little bit of a slug when it comes to my basic bioenergy. But am I starting to, I think there's more that can be said, but am I connecting to the question?
Yes, and I think I was just wondering if cross-hemisphere interaction played a part in this. So I suppose if you're breathing, you're still getting some cross-hemisphere if you're breathing through both nostrils. And
Yeah. Okay.
because I mean, when you're talking about the base, you know, I mean, that is so far before our senses. And then I just wanted to see how the somatic walking that you talked about.
Well, yeah, and in fact, Thich Nhat Hanh, such a well-known figure in the Buddhist world, and it's not unique to him, but he talks about walking meditation is a very big part of what he has taught, which comes from his actual Zen tradition. So, and he would go further and say you can meditate on eating, you can meditate on washing the dishes, just about any activity, and those, of course, would all be somatic too. So, interestingly, if you're really interested in a very somatic kind of spirituality, he would say, others would say as well, you could make any activity. It's all in the attitude that and intention that you bring to it, a spiritual practice.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
I wonder, is there any nuance difference between self-realization in contemplative yoga tradition and Jungian psychology and Abraham Maslow's self-actualization in his hierarchy of needs in the pyramid? Is it basically the same, or there are some nuances which can help us differentiate between it?
Okay, so we're going to look at three things. We're going to look at Maslow's self-actualization, his pyramid,
pyramid.
Jung's psychology, and then the contemplative
They
yoga.
both talk about self-actualization.
Yes, so what would be the differences and convergences? Okay. Well, the one I know least, although I had a lot of respect for it, I just haven't read it in quite a long time, would be Maslow's, philosophy. And ultimately, as I recall, the notion of being was very important. And, with the pyramid, down at the ground level, it's like, first of all, we have to take care of our basic survival, our physical needs, and so forth. And as you rise up, and some of that involves, being oriented towards having things. You need food, you need shelter, and so forth. But the higher you ascend in that actualization process, if there's enough support from the environment, right, and you have the appropriate means, you move towards, I think he called them being values.
Yeah.
And then he had the notion of peak experiences, which could be a secular psychological way of speaking about what, religious traditions might call mystical experiences, or what Jungians might call numinous experiences. So my recollection of it, and it was a psychology that was interested in human potential, was that a well-lived life that had the appropriate support would reach ever greater levels of refinement, in which you would ultimately, being self-actualized, would really be not only knowing who you are, in terms of having a coherent identity, and having good self-esteem for who and what you are, but ultimately it sort of, I think, heads into a zone that would be, close to what the contemplative traditions are aiming at, some realm of actually feeling profoundly at peace and whole with what you are, that you don't need something else to complete and make you whole. So that's just my kind of riff, on Maslow. With Jung and Jungians, I think the idea is that, and I tried to suggest this a little bit, that we have parts of us that aren't congealed, as we develop it as human beings. And some of them are outright disavowed for any number of reasons. And psychological growth involves being able to look at aspects of ourselves and difficult experiences we've had so that we can actually hold and include them in a way that gets ever more integrated, in a way that you can say, yes, I'm all of this. I may not be only all of that, but nothing's pushed outside, and therefore you don't have to either repress or project. And so self-realization ultimately becomes, it's hard to know exactly, what it is for Jung or other people that say that they follow the Jungian path, but it seems to be the experience of a profound degree of wholeness and completeness that is intrinsically felt to be of great value, and that all of your effort really has been sort of in the service of that. So the mandala actually is kind of a metaphor for finding this point of integration that enables you to be as complete and whole as you can be. With the contemplative yoga traditions, it can differ in several respects, because I did try to say it isn't a single thing, and that some of these paths traditionally have been renunciatory in terms of participation in the world, therefore either suited particularly for monastic people or for people who simply think, the world is too much with me. I want to really pull back. Or even, to be fair to the whole belief system, that basically the aim is actually to get off the wheel. And the wheel being the symbol for, you have repeated lives. And, you keep coming back and experiencing all the travail, joys and travails of human life. But the ultimate purpose is actually to not be compelled to come back. And the Buddhist tradition would say, well, you could, but you could be enlightened and choose to come back solely for the purpose of really benefiting others who are kind of trapped in the wheel. So that is part of it. That's the religious dimension, that means that there's something kind of fundamentally problematic about human existence such that we actually really ultimately want to get out of it. So to be honest and fair, the Yoga Sutra in particular, depending on how you read it, does kind of give that message. But when you shift into the Bhagavad Gita and then into the Tantric, both of those traditions, it really changes a great deal. The idea is actually to experience the divine, either theistically or not, in your human relational life. And the idea of being a monk or nun is sometimes, particularly in the Tantric iterations, thought to be sort of a less complete path. Because you sort of insulate yourself, take yourself out of a lot of situations that might be otherwise difficult, to live, to deal with. And actually the real proof of your awakening would be that you can be right in the fire. You can be in the midst of difficulties and manage it with grace. So, I don't know, did that help?
It does. So, is it the same as Sufi search for the beloved?
The search for the beloved?
Yeah.
Well, they're definitely, that's a big part of the Hindu yoga tradition, for sure, especially when some of it's inflected theistically, some of it not. But actually, quantitatively, if you want to be honest about it, and I alluded a little bit earlier, for example, how this path of discriminating knowledge, I'm not going to try to quantify it in any exact terms, but it's actually a very small percentage of any culture, including Indian culture, where people want to pursue that path temperamentally. Whereas the path of love would be the other end of it. We all, if we feel good about being human, we all love and have been loved. And then the idea of the beloved, the capital B, this is like the divine is somehow the greatest love of all, and you love it and it loves you. So, without a doubt, that is a big part of the yoga, especially what are called the bhakti traditions, which is where you get a lot of the devotional singing and chanting. Now, do you have that in, go back to your original question, is there the beloved in Jungian psychology or in Maslow's psychology? Maybe, but I guess you'd have to look at how the individual who uses that as their sort of frame, their worldview, how does it actually play out in their life? I wouldn't want to say that it couldn't be possible, but it might be an issue here of language, because essentially, and again, I hope, don't be shy. If there's people in here that know more about Maslow or than I do, or even Jung for that matter, jump in. But I think psychology in general, is a secular discourse. So it doesn't typically speak of the friend with a capital F or the beloved, because it's not its language. Although when many Jungians do speak about the sacred marriage, the union of the masculine and feminine principles, and then when you look at imagery, that archetypal imagery that expresses that, then you get awfully close. Or maybe you're already there. Or if you're a person like myself, I like to think of myself as polymorphous perverse. I'm saying that a little facetiously because I kind of want it all those ways. I mean, there's a big part of me that's secular, and I'm fine with that and want to be that. There's another part, I do have a sort of religious, spiritual sensibility. I want that too. So in fact, in my own case, and maybe this is part of what it relates a little bit to the idea of writing a book on integrative spirituality, is, I sometimes have said, I'm a Hindu, Buddhist, Jungian. I'm probably more than that, but I say at least those three things because for me personally, and this is no critique of any of those three things, I find there's something a little bit lacking for me in each of those. Or to say it another way, there's something very special in each of those three things. So rather than leave it abstractly, I'll just give you a little sense of what that might be for me. So I think without the Jungian way of looking at life and experience, I feel I would be ill-equipped to deal with the basic existential psychological issues and emotions that have arisen in my life. And it's certainly this idea of the shadow, the darker things that you don't want to acknowledge in yourself and how to engage those. So I find, I mentioned this phrase, spiritual bypassing. By and large, one of the biggest pitfalls of spiritual traditions is people in groups and the teachers of those groups don't provide much help dealing with your feelings of anger or your feelings of fear or your feelings of depression or your difficulty relating. You're sort of, and there's even the sense that if you just meditate or contemplate enough, probably those issues will go away. Well, don't count on it, So I find there's something, I'm attracted to the Hindu tradition. For some ways I can't even put in the language, I don't even know. I mean, when I go to India, I just think, God, I'm home. I just love this place. I love Indian people. I love Indian music. I love their text. So I don't even know why I'm so attracted to it. But there's something kind of aesthetically beautiful that attracts me. So I've mostly done most of my practices in that area. But just to finish this business of being a Hindu, Buddhist, Jungian, the Buddhist tradition, which I've also practiced in as well, their idea, the way that the emphasis that they put on compassion and loving kindness and the practices that they have for that just seem to be, I don't know anyone that does that any better than that. And I think I know people, for example, that have done meditative practices, but they don't seem to be actually cultivating a whole lot of compassion. But in many, if not all, the Buddhist traditions, it's like, yes, you learn how to do sitting meditation, and you also learn how to do loving kindness practice, and you know how to do, learn how to do compassion practice. So the fact that those elements, that relational concern for other people in the world, I wouldn't want to be without that. And I found that, not only useful, but also a corrective to just being too focused maybe on my own interior life and my own self-development. I think it's easy to fall into that. It can be kind of a rarefied spiritual narcissism. And we really need to be there for other people in the world. So that was a long-winded answer.
Michael Pollan, who wrote The Omnivore's Dilemma, has written a new book about the revival of psychedelic therapy.
Yes.
And it was interesting to me to see that image because he's reporting that, I don't know what percentage of people who are undergoing this psychedelic therapy feel that they're getting to the witness or they're getting to some of these higher states and they're reporting that. I was just curious what you think might be the effect of sort of this revival of
Yeah, well, we're
psychedelic
going to
therapy.
find out. It's underway, and it's been underway for a while, I think maybe 10, 15 years, and it's picking up steam. And I actually have that book. It was given to me, and
Right.
I'm only a couple chapters into it. It's a pretty fascinating read. So I have to say, at one level, it's above my pay grade and just direct experience to talk about the sort of reemergence of this
Right.
and the micro doses that are being calibrated. I have every reason to imagine it could be fairly effective, and again, as I said, we're going to see. But I'll have two other things to say. You know, I did live I'm old enough to have lived through a time when these psychedelic drugs were around the first time. Did a limited number of those experiences. I think in fact, I would have to actually say it was a huge impetus for wanting to take up meditation and yoga. And I had the conviction then, and I still have it now, that when those experiences weren't bad trips, as they were called, or positive experiences, you could get a glimpse, but it was very hard to repeat that, without taking those drugs again. And actually, you might get diminishing returns if you did, or have rather different kind of experiences. So I did a limited amount of that, and it gave me a sense of dimensions of the cosmos and of my being that might be there, and I wanted to pursue them in a non-drug based, kind of manner. But the other thing I will add, and it is a contemporary book, so Daniel Goleman, who's famous for the book on emotional intelligence, and Richard Davidson, who has a research lab, has collaborated, they both have, with the Dalai Lama and a number of other Buddhists. They just published a book together. They actually were at Harvard during that early phase as well, but they've had long, distinguished careers, each one of them. And the book is called Changing Traits, and it's a deliberate play on, it's called Altered Traits, rather than Altered States. And, the strong argument there, with or without drugs, is that it's not so much these elevated experiences that are important. It's whether they actually translate into the kind of person you are and how you actually act, in the world. I just completely agree with that. And in fact, I don't know what the worth really would be of having, truly ecstatic experiences that were simply wonderful memories, but made very little difference on your capacity to be more loving, more related, more capable of serving and being of benefit. I think not worth a lot, not spiritually speaking, worth a lot. But I think we're going to be reading a lot more, because this is something, the legal prohibitions have been lifted, the labs are doing work and clinical studies, and we're going to find out.
So you mentioned, sorry if I don't remember this from class back in the day, but you mentioned that there's really a sort of more original one asana, and then that became,
Yes.
many.
Yes.
Is that, I imagine that's also kind of true with the chakra system. I've been told that this sort of more fully imaged embellishments with the animals and the shapes and the symbols of the chakras are something that are more, I don't know if I was told that they were more Western influenced, or at least they stuck with. What is that for a more original yogic practice? What's the history of that development?
Okay, now if I veer off the question a little bit, just get me back on it, because, the first thing that occurs to me is that the proliferation of postures, of yoga postures, definitely is something that occurred recently in the yoga tradition, which actually means the medieval period.
Okay.
So that, it's a long ways for us, not a long, but it's recent in the long span of yoga history. Now, it would be a really good research question and researchable, you know, to find out. I think you could probably find early, meaning possibly even before the Common Era and early Common Era, representations of chakras in one way or another. But their elaboration in the, like even the images I showed you there, which were actually done by Harish Johari, who was an Indian, and was a Tantric yogi and artist. Those would be fairly indigenous Indian type images. And I think there are different numbers. I mean, this was the 7 system if you count the crown.
Right.
Some people actually, even in that system, think the crown is actually a whole nother thing, kind of above the 6 that are more associated with the subtle body. But I think that, you know, it is, so the postures and the elaboration, the symbolic elaboration of the chakras and different versions of those systems are kind of emerged in the medieval period and are part of Tantra. Whether, and most scholars, even people who are yoga teachers, don't necessarily, you know that. They don't really have to know it, but you know. But to your other point, that's part of your question, as I heard it, you know, beginning, I don't want to praise or blame any particular person, I just mean this kind of descriptively, but Carolyn Myss, with her book on the chakras, I forget, The Anatomy of, somebody must know this book. Anatomy of Spirit. Okay, so that was an early Western book as a Western intuitive healer. That actually I still own it. I still think it's a good book. But at the beginning, with publications like that, and I'm not saying that that's the first one. That book was probably published now 25 years ago, maybe thereabouts. There became a kind of conjoining of Western models of healing and health with the appropriation of, you know, Chinese medicine, the Hindu chakras, and so forth. And now it is tricky and difficult because you go to your bookstore and you buy a book on the chakras, and it could be heavily inflected in terms of color, even some of the symbols, with a Western overlay. And that isn't necessarily an altogether bad thing. I mean, if it turns out that that different models of healing used in the West actually are efficacious and they make use of this, and there's a kind of syncretism going on between what Western people know and some accuracy about the material that they've taken from the, say, the Hindu traditions. There's also Buddhist chakra systems and so forth. It can be good. And in fact, the person that, and I've looked at a number of her books, Anodea Judith, or is it Judith Anodea? Yeah, it must be Anodea Judith. She's probably written 12 books on the chakras by now. And one of them, you know, that reflects this kind of integration. It's actually a good kind of source. It's called something like, let's see if we can get it right. Because its title is slightly not intuitive. It's either Eastern Mind, Western Body, or the flip.
Okay.
Right? And it's a really well-written book, and it's about 400 some pages. I actually signed it for a course in the Somatic program a year or so ago. And it's been out a while, but I liked it because in the preface, in the introduction, she explains that she's actually trying to integrate several things. The Hindu contemplative yoga system, somatic psychology, and some other body-oriented psychotherapy, and I guess some health theory, or I don't know how to describe it. And I think she knows what these things are on their own terms, and then, you know, weaves them together in a way that I think is actually quite good. But how much of other people's works on chakras do that well, I suspect there's a lot of muddle.
Right.
Yeah, and therefore sometimes some trivializing, some distorting, but it doesn't, that's my thought.
Okay. No, that's helpful. I mean, I know Jung consults them and Campbell too, and
No, but see,
wondering,
interestingly, even with Jung, see, and because I did that little gloss there on that seminar in Kundalini Yoga, well, he did something there that he also did with the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And actually, I give him a pass, because what he did in both cases is he said, look, I am rendering these as for purposes of my own psychology. And he took both of them to be evidence, this is a phrase, of individuation from other cultures. And then he shows you how he's actually quite kind of clear about how he's sort of misreading them intentionally. I actually think he did know what these things meant on their own terms. But to give take for example the second chakra, when he called it the mandala of baptism in this descent, that's not really actually how the yoga tradition
that's what
renders
made
it.
me wonder.
But he wanted to, it fit how he thinks individuation works, in his psychology, that first of all you do go down, and you have to deal with what you find there. So that wasn't exactly how yogis would render what happens, at that chakra. And then analogously with the Book of the Dead, he actually said to make it useful, we need to read it backwards. And then he read it as, he called it evidence of it. He said it gives us a picture of an initiation process, and the only one we have left in the West is psychoanalysis. So he basically said, instead of thinking about, what happens when you're exiting, he was actually trying to see how it was that it was actually a way to understand the way you move forward in life, not into death. But I think he was clear, and then there are people who want to pick a fight with that, and they can, but I think he did contextualize what he was doing, and he did know what these things meant in their respective traditions. Yes?
It was about the slide. It was about the picture there that was there.
You want to see that picture again? Okay, that turned out to be a good slide.
Then the center,
Yes.
the 9 is the pure consciousness.
Yes.
Is what we are, what we are, right?
Well, that's what the contemplative yogis would say. That Hindus and Buddhists would say that. The Sufis would probably say that. The Kabbalists would probably say that. And you might say that. I would say that. But it's a debatable point. I mean, this is like these are certain visions of life and what we may be. Not everybody would agree. Definitely not.
But when it says Buddha nature, it's about the point of view, but it could be a human nature too. Because
I want to hear the question or see what I can.
I don't know. It was to confirm that center.
Yeah, is that our essence?
Yes.
Well, I would say that, and this contemplative yoga tradition that I'm speaking of would say that, and these other contemplative wisdom traditions would say that, even though they would have different language for it.
Yeah.
But within a more secular, materialist frame, including a number of different psychologies, there would be either a flat-out denial that there is such a nature, unconditioned nature, or skepticism or outright denial. But that gets us into the question of, if you, for example, think, well, let's just take the idea of, there's a philosophy called, that everything, there's a number of different contemporary views that think that everything is a construction, and that our life is entirely a historical phenomenon. It's completely based on what has happened in time. And to posit that there's this unconditioned, kind of timeless essence to our being, the comments would simply be there's no evidence for that. So that would be operating within a philosophical materialist frame. And a lot of Western discourse operates there. In fact, Jung was unusual. And in Memories, Dreams, Reflection, there's this famous passage, early on where he says, I have personality number 1 and personality number 2. And he describes personality 1. Everybody know that passage? Most of you? Okay, that is this schoolboy who has certain parents and has certain experiences. But this personality number 2, he's describing as he's already wise. He's old. He knows everything. He's been with God. Some timeless part of himself. Well, that simply wouldn't have been popular with Freud, wouldn't have been popular with other people in the psychoanalytic community at this time. That actually kind of made him, rather odd. Because even then, in the early 20th century, that was basically breaking out of the kind of parameters for what, could be known or justified.
But is it trying a Buddhist one?
This one happens to be a Buddhist diagram.
Ah, okay.
But, in
Not Young.
No, this is a very specific, one of the more influential Buddhist schools, more recent schools, called the Yoga school. But even if you didn't delineate 9 consciousnesses, all Buddhist traditions would say that there is this aspect to who we are. But they would give it different names. So Buddha nature is an uncharacteristically positive term. It sounds like something. Whereas it could also be called emptiness or the no self, which to our ears sounds kind of either negative or incomprehensible. Okay, I think we're probably, are we at the end? I think
Yeah.
Well, thank you everybody again for coming and staying
Thank you,
tuned.
Patrick.